Maybe let's start with the most urgent issue that we're seeing ourselves in today. We have yet another deadline and an ultimatum from the US President today. Maybe give us a bit of your perspective of what we should be preparing for over the next 24 hours.
So I appreciate that that is the starting point, because it is so pressing and it does occupy so much of my attention these days, diplomatically, internationally. So maybe I'll just speak about my international work and then move to the domestic, a couple domestic points. Internationally, Canada stands for, as I mentioned in the remarks, certain fundamental principles. And one of those principles is international law and international humanitarian law. So any attempt to target civilians or civilian infrastructure must be recognized as contrary to international law and international humanitarian law, and in particular the Geneva Conventions. Civilian infrastructure is indeed what keeps civilians themselves safe. Neither should be the object of military decisions, period. And that is our position internationally, and it applies to all states. Indeed, what we want to ensure we're doing diplomatically is building those bridges with countries who share those values. So in my work in the Middle East last week, in fact, I was speaking with the Foreign Minister, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh to ensure that we are working with the Gulf countries to support them against retaliatory strikes from Iran, to support them and the global economy in ensuring advocacy for the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, but also to say that this is a moment for de-escalation. And we need to work together as countries to ensure that that occurs. So that's a summary of the international work that I'm engaged in right now. And then domestically, of course, the impact of this conflict, the impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, where we have 20% of the global energy supply being held at a choke point, is something that highlights to us that diversification is the way to de-risk. And we have learned this lesson before, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But this is a moment where we, having already said that we will contribute 23 million barrels towards the stabilization of the global energy supply chain, we have to say to ourselves domestically, how can we continue to leverage our resources for the benefit of this country in the short and the long term? And that's the work we're doing across the board, not only in response to this particular conflict, but generally speaking to ensure that never again are we, for example, 80% dependent on one economy.
It was a remarkable weekend to look at some of the comments that were made from the US President. It's probably an understatement. But you know, from your perspective, how does Canada navigate this increasingly tense situation of foreign policy of the United States with a leader that seems more and more chaotic, but also trying to maintain that close relationship as an ally?
So there is no question that our geographical position is not going to change. We will always be in this very close proximity physically with our largest trading partner. The question is, how can we leverage our domestic economic policy and our foreign policy to strengthen our own position? And if you think about it, the idea that we will have one minister for Canada-US trade and then another minister for all other aspects of foreign policy is astute, because we are emphasizing the importance of both and the importance of ensuring that we are building strong trade relationships outside of our largest trading partner, so that our economy will, through diversification, ensure that we are de-risking that away from that current situation with the United States. And so that's a high-level answer to say that work continues. Even before the Prime Minister became the Prime Minister, we were the only G7 country with a free trade agreement with every G7 country. But we're not stopping there. We're saying over and above those large agreements, CPTPP comes to mind, what else can we do bilaterally? What else can we do multilaterally? And so with Minister Sidhu, that is the work that I'm doing to build strong economic relationships.
So you talked about the Prime Minister's speech in Davos, and I think all of us that resonated very deeply with us. But you talk about this great opportunity that we have here in British Columbia, the gateway to the Indo-Pacific, the Asia-Pacific. You look at British Columbia having what the world needs, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's in technology or LNG or clean energy. So for this group of business leaders, given what we're seeing in this shift, what do we need to do in this business community to operationalize what the Prime Minister said and this shift that we're seeing in foreign policy?
So the one thing that always strikes me, and I did like 22 years of teaching in corporate securities law before coming into government, so really studied the domestic economy and the importance and presence of SMEs in our economy. And I will say that we're operating at a number of levels to ensure a strong domestic economy. The federal government, together with the provinces, has to ensure that the infrastructure, the trade infrastructure exists, like strong trade agreements, like bilateral trade agreements. As I mentioned, the India CEPA comes to mind, but there are many other examples, including ASEAN, Mercosur, those types of examples. But the infrastructure alone isn't enough. At a grassroots corporate level, SMEs have to diversify away from the United States economy themselves and utilize the framework that we're putting into place.
So specifically, what is the government doing to support SMEs? And there's an additional question too, which we'll get to in a minute, about the investments that the government is putting into this.
Good. So, sorry, I sound like a professor there. Good question. So, what we've introduced is use it or lose it provision for critical minerals in British Columbia and the North. So use it or lose it simply mandates that if large carriers don't use their spectrum in remote areas, for example, it will be forfeited to local operators who can demonstrate a plan to develop the region. It's just one example of how we want to say that we're there to support the domestic economy in a particular province, but we also want to say at another level, we're building that trade infrastructure that you can utilize once an agreement is finalized.
And for SMEs that are looking to diversify their exports, what is the government doing to help them along their journey?
So the overall goal is to reduce structural dependence on the United States. We have a $5 billion trade diversification corridors fund, a $1 billion Arctic infrastructure fund. Those are part of our efforts to diversify trade and to assist local businesses and SMEs along the way. What we're trying to do is to ensure that while we want foreign direct investment, we don't want passive resource banking by foreign state-owned enterprises. And so what we need to do is ensure that there's available capital for small to medium-sized enterprises, which actually account for over 90% of the corporations in this country. We're also playing a leading role in the DSRB, the Defense Security and Resilience Bank, which is hosting negotiations in Montreal. Essentially what that DSRB is, and I'm not sure if you've discussed this with your members.
The Board of Trade led the steering committee as we put in a bid for Vancouver, a number of other.
So the greatest thing about that is that it's a cross-country effort. We all want to see the DSRB succeed, and internationally, what I'm doing is trying to bring other countries to the table to say that if we pool capital, we will be able to support SMEs who want to respond to demand, but don't necessarily have the capital at the first instance to ramp up. And we saw this when Russia further illegally invaded Ukraine. There was incredible demand for 155 millimeter ammunition and other types of military equipment for Ukraine. But the capital wasn't there. And so we need to solve this problem through the DSRB.
And recognizing that there's still a fairly long way to go in negotiations, and yes, even us here on the Vancouver Bid Committee would agree it is Canada first. But could you give us your perspective as the decision will be made, if it is awarded to Canada, and if that is the model, it is the Prime Minister's decision, we fully understand that. But we feel strongly that Vancouver has a strategic advantage in placing all or part of the operations here, large part because we are seen as this tri-continental bridge. What is your perspective on where the bank should be in Canada? Do you have a perspective, or are you leaving that entirely to the Prime Minister as well?
All the hard questions. So what I would say to you, as I've said to others, is advocacy is your friend at this point, in the sense that the decision hasn't been made. We want to play a leading role as a country. We are hosting the negotiations for the charter for the DSRB in Montreal. But at this time, the work you're doing to advocate for this city, for this province, for this region, in fact, is fundamental. It is what everyone else who wants to host is doing at this time. And in order to remain competitive, I would say advocacy is your friend.
Understood. We have some questions here talking about diversification. The most popular question is about whether Canada should join the EU. What is your thinking about that and about future Canada-EU relations?
Okay, well, I'll start with a little comical moment in my life on this. That, you know, we're quite close as G7 foreign ministers, and my counterparts in France and Germany recently filmed a video beside the Berlin Gate to invite Canada to join the EU. And so I was with them in Paris, and I was like, guys, what are you doing? On a more serious note, I understand the impetus for the question. The gist of the question is something that we feel too, that there is a sense of being like-minded with many of the EU countries, and in particular, we're pushing on that open door by being the only non-European country to be a member of the SAFE, to allow our defense companies here in Canada to compete for defense procurement contracts on the same level, on the same terms as European companies, to ensure that we have the CETA agreement, that free trade agreement with EU countries, to ensure that we have strong alliances bilaterally as well as multilaterally. And so I would say the question emanates from, a similar position, which is we'll push on that door in order to diversify, to de-risk, in order to ensure that we double non-US trade over the next 10 years. This is an important point. It's fundamental to our foreign policy.
We are nearly out of time already, so maybe I'll finish off with an invitation for you to have a call to action for the business community here. Given what you're saying about the opportunity and the urgency, and as Canada is really shifting in its trade policy and its foreign policy, what specifically should these business leaders do, given our role and really our strategic location in the Canadian fabric? How do these business leaders here leverage the opportunity?
So I'll answer that question by looking collectively at what you can do and then individually. Collectively, the work that you're doing at the Board of Trade is fundamentally important. This Board of Trade is well recognized as a stalwart, as a leader, as a place for us to have the conversation about what the local economy needs and what the national economy can deliver with BC businesses. So this is across sectors. Of course, natural resources, critical minerals, and LNG, of course, those issues occur. But the tech sector here, the life sciences work, the manufacturing, the human resources that you are able to leverage in this province are second to none, and that is something that needs to continue to be heard. The second thing I will say collectively is this idea of being the gateway to the Indo-Pacific is fundamentally important. I feel that you know that idea, so I don't want to sound redundant, but I cannot stress enough how important the work in the Indo-Pacific is right now for our government. Remember, I was 4 months in to being the foreign minister last fall when I made a trip to India and China to ensure that we were opening doors to those large economies that you cannot ignore. Yes, there are concerns relating to public safety, relating to issues surrounding human rights. I make sure to address those issues at the table. And I also say that we have to operate on another track to ensure that we're pushing Canada's economic interests. Similarly with the ASEAN, ensuring that I was there in July, that's just 2 months after I was appointed. It's no mistake that those were some of my very first trips as foreign minister, to ensure that we're paving the road with our relationships internationally for strong negotiations and partnerships, and to ensure that Canadian businesses can see that those opportunities are going to continue to develop. So your question though was what BC businesses can do. So I'll bring that back to individual businesses. We have trade trips and visits that Minister Sidhu organizes routinely to the region. We also have bilateral trade agreements that are forming over and above those multilateral negotiations. Indonesia is just one example. We have negotiations that are occurring with Philippines. That's going to be the site of the ASEAN meeting in July. I will be there. Making sure that you show up in those regions yourself as businesses to open their eyes, to be on the ground with our diplomatic staff, to ensure that we're building links not just through government, but B2B. So I always say B2B, P2P, G2G, and then cross all of those wires in order to ensure that there's maximum success for your sector, for your business, and then bring those lessons back here to the Board of Trade and to the Government of Canada so that we can leverage your experience and your expertise for the benefit of the broader economy. And I'll just close by saying that 70% of multinationals in this country report actively diversifying supply chains away from high-risk regions since COVID. This concept of diversification should not become a buzzword. It has to become the mantra for the work that we are doing internationally to benefit the domestic economy locally and across the country.
Minister, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.